This is the ZimaCube Pro, and it has all of the makings of a perfect home server. Well, it should at least. It has ample storage both for mechanical hard drives and NVMe SSDs, a fairly capable modern CPU, multiple options for fast networking, and PCIe expansion for anything else you could think of. With all of these features in a sleek-looking package, it kind of seems like this would be a no-brainer for the perfect all-in-one home server. But, well, there might be some issues, so let's check it out. This is the ZimaCube Pro, the bigger brother of the standard ZimaCube, which you might remember I took a look at a little while back. Well, actually, I took a look at a prototype that I didn't quite realize was a prototype. In that video, I was pretty critical of the ZimaCube, and while some of those criticisms were just due to it being a prototype, there were definitely some issues primarily with the limitations of PCIe lanes thanks to the N100 CPU. This is the more expensive version, which comes with a more powerful CPU and also shouldn't be constrained quite as much by the lack of PCIe lanes. Now, I did reach out to Icewell and confirm this is in fact a final production model. Well, mostly. I'll get to that here in a bit. If you do buy a ZimaCube or ZimaCube Pro, it will come pre-installed with ZimaOS, which is Icewell's own operating system. ZimaOS definitely seems to still be in development, and I really didn't want to cover it, A, because that would probably be a video all of its own, and B, if I were to buy one of these for myself, I probably wouldn't use ZimaOS. Instead, I would install something like Proxmox or TrueNAS or Unraid, and so that's sort of how I wanted to approach this video, where I focus mostly on the hardware and install other third-party operating systems. Now, while doing all of the testing for this video, I spent a lot of time sitting. Actually, doing YouTube full-time means I pretty much sit all day, and probably one of the best investments I've ever made is in my chair, which came from the sponsor of today's video, Flexispot. Now, Flexispot didn't want me to talk about this chair. They actually wanted me to talk about the C7, but I bought mine from Flexispot over a year ago, and I'm used to it and I love it and had no need to replace it. But my wife, well, she's been stuck in this cheap chair which has zero options in terms of adjustments. So I figured, why not upgrade her setup? And the C7 is definitely an upgrade. First of all, this thing has a dynamic lumbar support that adjusts to your movements to help keep your lower back supported. It also has an adjustable headrest, armrests that move in just about any direction you could want, and adjustable seat depth, as well as a forward tilt option to help relieve pressure on your lower back. Plus, it's super comfortable with a breathable mesh back, a recline range from 90 to 128 degrees, and an optional footrest for when you want to kick back and relax a bit. It's also quite spacious with 21 inches of hip width, over 26 inches of shoulder width, and it supports up to 300 pounds. Perfect for just about anyone that spends long hours sitting. And the best part? You can return it for free within 30 days if it's not a good fit. Plus, the C7 comes with a 10-year warranty, so you can be confident that it's a purchase that's going to last you for years to come. So don't underestimate the importance of a good chair. Check out the C7 from Flexispot today and use the code C730 to get $30 off your purchase. As I mentioned earlier, the ZimaCube Pro comes with some nice upgrades over the standard ZimaCube. First of all, instead of the N100, it uses an Intel i5-1235U, which has 2 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores, giving it a total of 12 threads. It also comes with Intel's Iris Xe graphics, and more importantly, has up to 20 PCIe lanes, 11 more than the N100. The ZimaCube Pro comes standard with 16GB of DDR5, but can be expanded up to 64GB. And it also comes with a 256GB NVMe SSD for the operating system. On the front, there are the 6 SATA hot swap drive bays for 3.5-inch or 2.5-inch drives, as well as this 7th bay, which is actually this interesting U.2 carrier card, which has room for 4 NVMe SSDs. Above the drive bays is the power button, a combo audio jack, and 3 USB 3.0 ports, one of which is Type-C, with 2 being Type-A. On the back, there's a display port and HDMI port, 2 Intel i226V 2.5GB ports, as well as a 10GB RJ45 port. You also get 2 more USB 3.0 ports, as well as 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. There's also a DC barrel jack because this entire unit, including the backplane, is powered from a 19-volt external power brick. You can remove 4 screws on the side and lift off the top cover to get access to the motherboard. There, the first thing you'll probably notice are the 2 PCIe slots, which use x 16 and x 8 physical slots. However, they're actually only wired up for Gen 4x4 and Gen 3x2. There technically are 2 M.2 sockets, one of which is for the NVMe SSD for the boot drive, but the other is actually populated by the 10GB NIC. That's because Icewhale decided to use a very interesting M.2 10 gigabit NIC, which I believe is from IOCrest, but it uses the AQC107 10 gigabit Ethernet controller. There's also an internal USB port, which by default is populated by a wireless adapter. Now, if you haven't seen any ZimaCube coverage, you probably wouldn't be expecting to see these two EDP connections, which are actually carrying PCIe between the motherboard and the backplane. Now, technically EDP is a communication protocol, not the actual cable and connector, I know, but typically you'd see an EDP cable between a motherboard and a laptop display. But technically it does work for PCIe, so that's what Icewhale decided to use to connect the motherboard to the backplane. Now that provides a PCIe connection to the backplane, but to actually power the backplane, there's a 4-pin 19-volt header that comes off of the motherboard. There's a fairly small cooler for the CPU, as well as two 80mm fans on the back for cooling the drives. Now just looking at all of the hardware as is, it's pretty impressive. You have a lot of room for hard drives, SSDs, you have fast networking, PCIe expandability for a graphics card or whatever else, and a capable CPU. But before even turning this thing on, there were already a few things that maybe bothered me or just sort of confused me. First of all, the 10 gig NIC being in an M.2 form factor kind of threw me off at first. It does seem a bit weird, but when you really think about it, it's actually not that bad. For example, if you knew you wanted to switch to using SFP Plus instead of RJ45, or maybe you wanted to add even faster networking and didn't need the 10 gigabit networking, if the 10 gig NIC was embedded in the motherboard, those PCIe lanes would be permanently used up and you couldn't use them for something else. Whereas with using this M.2 form factor, you could technically unplug the 10 gig NIC and add in another SSD or some other M.2 device and take advantage of those extra lanes. So it looks a bit odd, but I definitely don't hate it. The M.2 slots that actually concern me are these that are on this little U.2 carrier card thing. Because all four of these are going through a single U.2 connection, at best, all of these are going to be sharing just 4 lanes of PCIe. Now, Icewhale does sort of explain this on their spec sheet, where they say that there are 4 M.2s at 3200 megabytes per second, and that's a bit of a weird way to describe the connection, but I assumed that most likely meant that all 4 of these were sharing 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 3, as that seemed to be sort of the closest conversion to 3200 megabytes per second. And spoiler alert, after some testing, I found that that is in fact the case. All 4 of these are on a PCIe switch, sharing 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 3, which theoretically, if you're just reading off of a single drive, you're getting the full performance of that drive as long as it's a Gen 3 NVMe SSD. But as soon as you start trying to read and write across all 4 drives, they're going to have to share that bandwidth. Now, I don't want to jump ahead too much here, but really, I don't think this is that bad of a decision, as most likely you're going to be limited to 10 gigabit networking, and unless you jump to like 40 gigabit networking, you're not really going to see just a pure bandwidth limitation by all 4 of these sharing the same 4 lanes. You'll still get a lot of the same benefits of latency and IOPS, and so I think it's a pretty decent trade-off, but we'll take a look at that a bit more here in a bit. Now, another weird thing that I noticed that's really not that important, but it threw me off at first, was this little ESP controller that's soldered to this card, which I eventually figured out is actually what controls this LED ring on the front. Now, what's really strange is this little controller actually communicates with the ZimaCube over Wi-Fi, because if you're using ZimaOS, you can customize, it seems, this little LED ring. Also, there's already some community firmware, I believe, that you can just flash to this to customize it yourself. I didn't really dive into that too much, as I just didn't really care. But I did find it a bit odd that there was just a little ESP microcontroller soldered on here. Another thing that had me a bit concerned was the cooling, or potentially the lack of cooling. The CPU cooler looked a little bit small, and I also noticed they were using the same skinny 80mm fans on the back, which in my original ZimaCube video had some issues primarily because there was no software fan control available. Now, the last thing that bothered me was the continued use of those EDP cables, which I'll come back to why later on in the video. But really, I couldn't come up with any good opinions on this until I actually put it to use. So I got everything plugged in and booted it up to find myself in ZimaOS. I did play around with ZimaOS for just a little bit, and I do have to say it seems like there are some potentially cool features, and I am excited to see how this develops over time, but like I said, I didn't spend much time testing it out. If you are interested in ZimaOS and how the ZimaCube would come straight out of the box, make sure and go check out Robbie's video over at NAS Compares, as he goes into a pretty big deep dive into the ZimaCube Pro as well as ZimaOS, and I believe he has a pretty in-depth follow-up video coming as well, so go subscribe, go like, go check out his videos. He does a great job over at NAS Compares. While the system could work well as a really simple NAS, like just running TrueNAS with no other services or anything, I figured with the CPU it has and some of the features, it would sort of be a bit overkill for something like that. So I decided to start out by installing Proxmox. Now, I didn't want to get rid of the ZimaOS install in case I wanted to come back and play with it, so I decided to swap out the SSD, which brought me to one of the first really annoying issues with the ZimaCube Pro, which is the fact that you can't get to the boot SSD without removing the CPU cooler. Fortunately, taking it off wasn't that hard, and I also noticed that they're using this metal heat spreader essentially for the cooler to make contact with instead of directly cooling the die, which probably helps make sure that anyone swapping out the cooler or thermal paste doesn't accidentally crack the die, but it also seems like it helps with standard cooler compatibility, which, well, I might have already hinted at earlier in the video. Once I got the SSD swapped out and the cooler back on, I hopped into the BIOS, which was pretty simple. There really weren't a ton of features to note, but I could at least make sure that VTD was enabled and that I could boot into the Proxmox installer. Proxmox installed with no issues, and this actually gave me a chance to see what the idle system power draw would be like without adding any hard drives or running any virtual machines or services. And, well, it's not great. Without any hard drives or SSDs with the system just sitting idle, it was drawing around 29 watts or so from the wall. It's actually kind of interesting because, at least with the prototype I checked out with the N100 model, that was the exact same idle power draw. Having Proxmox installed also gave me a chance to use LSPCI to check out the PCIe topology, which is where I confirmed that these 4 NVMe SSDs are sharing those 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 3. I also found that both internal M.2 sockets are sharing 2 lanes of PCIe Gen 3, and the ASM1166 SATA controller for the backplane is also using 2 lanes of PCIe Gen 3. Now, the PCIe slots are pretty clearly labeled on Icewhale's website, but just to confirm, I tossed in a few different cards, and sure enough, they're running at 4 lanes of Gen 4 and 2 lanes of Gen 3. Now, some people might look at this distribution of PCIe lanes and see it as a pretty big downside, but in reality, I think it's pretty well balanced. You do lose out on some things, like for example, only having 2 lanes of Gen 3 on the boot SSD, but in reality, I think it's pretty well balanced, especially for a NAS that I would assume is most likely going to be connecting to clients via a 10 gig connection at best. Now, if I were running this system with Proxmox, it's possible that I would use ZFS within Proxmox to create virtual disks for various virtual machines and such, but there's also a good chance I would want to virtualize TrueNAS or something like that and pass through the SATA controller, which is what I decided to do next. I added 6 4TB hard drives that I usually use for testing, and I also put in 4 1TB NVMe SSDs to the 7th bay. Then I set up an instance of TrueNAS Scale, enabled IOMMU, and passed through both the SATA controller and 10 gigabit NIC via PCIe pass-through. Once I got TrueNAS installed and running, everything seemed to show up and work just fine, with the only exception really being that drive temperatures weren't showing up in TrueNAS, but that seems to be an issue I run into all the time with TrueNAS Scale, so probably not the fault of the ZimaCube. I set up a pool with all 6 hard drives, set up an SMB share, and had no issues with reading files off of my NAS. But when I tried writing files to the NAS, I was getting this weird issue where I was getting like gigabit-ish speeds, and I couldn't quite figure it out. But spoiler, I found this to be an unrelated issue that I resolved a bit later. Now, originally, I had planned to use the NVMe SSDs to run virtual machines and such, but when I started having those write issues with TrueNAS, I decided to pass them through to TrueNAS as well, and then set up a striped pool of SSDs just to give myself sort of a best-case scenario when it came to drive speed, just to try to figure out what the issue was. Once I had that set up and started writing files to the SSDs, I was getting like nearly perfect 10 gig speeds, minus just a little bit of overhead from virtualization. However, when I tried reading files off of those SSDs, well, the ZimaCube just sort of locked up and crashed. So I rebooted the system and tried again, but once again, when I started reading a large file off of the NAS, it crashed. Now, I'm really not sure what the issue was here. My guess would be a combination of user error and the fact that PCIe pass-through isn't always necessarily the most stable and predictable thing. So to confirm that it wasn't some sort of issue with the ZimaCube, I decided to install TrueNAS Scale bare metal. Now, this meant that I had to, once again, remove the heatsink to replace the SSD, but then I was able to install TrueNAS Scale and then re-import my pools from the hard drives and the SSDs. However, once I connected over SMB and started transferring files again, I kept getting that weird 100 megabytes per second or so when I was writing to the hard drives. To see if it was an issue with the 10 gig NIC, I dropped in an SFP Plus card, but then I started getting other weird behavior where it just wouldn't write at all. And so finally, I just decided to start from scratch. I shut down the NAS, and I also shut down my computer, which I was using as the client at the time, rebooted everything, and then it worked fine. So I think it actually came down to being a client issue with Windows, which isn't a shocker by any means. It was just something I hadn't really run into before when testing with other devices, but like I said, it seemed to be an issue with Windows, not with the ZimaCube. I even took the SFP Plus card out and went back to the internal 10 gig NIC, and that also worked just fine, and really, with TrueNAS Scale, I had a really good and solid experience. Well, except for the noise. We'll tackle that later though. Now, I could have gone back to Proxmox, but it seemed like it was for the most part handling virtualization fine, other than that weird issue that only seemed to happen when I was trying to use the pass-through NVMe SSDs. So I decided to move on instead to Unraid. Like I said, I think this machine has the potential to be extremely well-rounded and operate as a do-it-all server with bulk storage and fast storage and the ability to run various virtual machines and services and such, and I think Unraid would be a really good operating system for that. I initially had 2 smart errors on 2 drives that popped up, and I was sort of worried it had something to do either with the SATA controller or the connections on the backplane. But I cleared those errors, and they never popped back up, even after using Unraid for multiple days after. Unlike in TrueNAS, in Unraid I could actually see the drive temperatures, which were all nice and cool. Well, except for this one NVMe SSD. Now, funnily enough, that wasn't even an SSD I was using. That was actually my TrueNAS boot SSD, and it wasn't doing anything, but it was getting pretty warm, and I eventually realized that it had to do with where it was at. First of all, the boot SSD location is right next to the CPU, but to make matters worse, the CPU heatsink actually just blows hot air right over it. So it was getting pretty warm when it really wasn't even doing anything, which is not great. But like I said, everything else worked really well. I set up all 6 drives in the array and set up all 4 NVMe SSDs in a cache pool. And with that caching, writing to the NAS, and for the most part reading off the NAS, was fully taking advantage of the 10 gig networking, and it was just buttery smooth and a really good experience. I also installed Jellyfin to see how well this could handle some hardware accelerated transcoding. Using the Intel Iris Xe graphics, I was able to get around 80 frames per second when transcoding 4K 10-bit HEVC down to 1080p. That was actually pretty impressive, but not as impressive as an NVIDIA RTX A2000, which I also decided to drop in. That sort of crushed it when it came to transcoding, but honestly was a bit overkill. Honestly, at this point in my testing, completely ignoring ZimaOS obviously, everything seemed to be pretty good, except for just a few things. Starting with power draw. If you're looking for something that just barely sips power, this isn't it. When running Unraid with all 6 hard drives and 4 NVMe SSDs, idle power draw was around 55 watts or so. Now if power's not that expensive for you, or you're just okay with that range, then 55 watts at idle with all of those drives is really not that bad. What was bad though was the noise. And this was caused by a few issues. First of all, the rear fans I think are just too small. They're 80mm fans, but pretty thin, and I just don't think they provide adequate cooling without having to spin up pretty fast. I'm assuming there's some temperature probe and some sort of controller that does all of this, but it does stink that you can't control those fan ramps to try to bring noise down a bit. The rear fans weren't quite as bad as the CPU cooler though, which really just seemed to not provide enough cooling for a CPU that can turbo up quite a bit. Basically, anytime you put the system under load, it would go from a fairly reasonable volume to just really loud really quickly, and there were some settings you could adjust in the BIOS to sort of smooth this ramp out a bit, but it really just seemed like the CPU cooler wasn't enough for the system. And it actually turns out that IceCube and Icewell seems to agree, as they actually announced a cooler upgrade, which has a larger heatsink, a larger fan, and also seems to not block the boot SSD, which is great. According to an email, they're going to be providing this for all future ZimaCube Pro models, and if you received a ZimaCube Pro model before the upgrade, you can get one for free, but you do have to pay for shipping, which is kind of a bummer. They also said they were going to send one over, but sadly I didn't get it in time for this video, and honestly I'm probably not going to do a follow-up just on that cooler. If you're interested, make sure once again to check out Robbie over at NAS Compares, as I'm pretty sure he's going to do a follow-up with the upgraded cooler. But for me, the noise didn't just come from the fans. Actually, the worst part of it was this obnoxious coil whine that I could not get to go away. It seemed to be coming from an inductor on the backplane, I would assume as part of filtering for SATA power or something, as it seemed to ramp up and down in volume and pitch based on drive activity. Now, to try and see if I could limit the noise a little bit, I decided to make the ZimaCube Pro Hardware Haven Edition. I took off the 80mm fans on the back and replaced them with some 80mm Noctua fans, which are quite a bit thicker. I also wanted to swap out the CPU cooler and found that some people had had some success with low-profile Intel coolers, which I thought I had something like that lying around but couldn't find it. So instead I had to use this tower cooler that I got for my cool home server video I did a little while back. And well, it did fit to the socket at least, not so much inside the case. But the ZimaCube Pro Hardware Haven Edition was substantially quieter. In fact, I basically couldn't hear the fans at all. But the coil whine was still just as obnoxious. Now, to be fair, I looked up quite a few forum posts and such about noise with the ZimaCubes, and no one there mentioned anything about coil whine. I also reached out to Robbie from NAS Compares, and he didn't have the issue. Of correspondence with Icewhale, they seemed a bit confused by it as well, so my guess is that I sort of got a dud, and most ZimaCube models won't have that obnoxious coil whine. With that being the case, and the fact that they're releasing a better cooler, it does look like the noise issues are going to be somewhat resolved, and you could always replace the 80mm fans on the back with some larger ones from Noctua, for example, to make the thing pretty much dead silent, I would assume. In fact, I already found a 3D model where you can 3D print a larger back cover that provides room for thicker 80mm fans, because of course there's one. So it seems like for the most part, the noise issue is mostly going to be resolved, but what about the price? Here's where I'm a bit torn. I think the system looks really cool, has a lot of great features, and for all the features it has, it seems to be pretty well balanced. But at the same time, at $1,200, does it really make sense? Okay, so just a really quick clarification. When I first wrote the script, the ZimaCube Pro was priced at $1,200, but it seems like they dropped the price recently down to $1,100. All right, back to the video. I mean, you could go grab a Johnsbow N3 case, an SFX power supply, and an MATX motherboard, and yeah, it might be a little tricky to find something with PCIe bifurcation to be able to get 4 or 5 NVMe SSDs, but for the most part, you could build a somewhat comparable system using standardized components and probably save a good amount of money. Plus, you would have a system that's upgradable for when you want to buy new components in the future, which actually brings me to my last point that I haven't mentioned yet. While certain aspects of this system are, or at least seem standardized, there's really no upgrade path outside of future products released by Icewhale. This is thanks to the power connector for the backplane and the use of PCIe over that EDP connection. Now realistically, the backplane power is probably a fairly overcomable issue if you wanted to modify the system in the future. Whether you're using a motherboard that uses DC power or using a mini PC, you could probably modify a 19-volt power supply and figure things out. But with that proprietary EDP connection, you're kind of stuck. And what's really frustrating to me is why not use Oculink? I mean, instead of 2 EDP cables, you could use 2 Oculink cables, one for 4 lanes for the U.2 card, and the other for the 2 lanes that go to the SATA controller. This probably wouldn't be a perfect solution for upgrades and stuff, but it at least means you could throw in a mini PC that has an Oculink connector and at least use the drives in the backplane, or I don't know, you could hook this up to a computer and use it as a DAS. I don't know, it might not be the perfect solution, but at least by using a standard connection, this would have a longer lifespan that doesn't rely on Icewhale releasing more ZimaCube products. Now, I did ask Icewhale about this, and their response was that due to structural and layout limitations, they had to go with a smaller connector. Now, I'm not an electronics engineer. I don't know how to make this type of hardware. I feel like they probably could have found a way to use Oculink if they wanted, but maybe not. Really, it doesn't matter what their motives were. The fact that it doesn't have it is a huge bummer, in my opinion. Now, one thing I think they could do, since they used that EDP connection, is release some sort of adapter, either a cable that's that EDP connection on one end and the SFF 8611 or whatever Oculink is on the other, or a by4 PCIe card that has that little EDP connection to where you could use an EDP cable but have a PCIe card adapter to be able to use this chassis with a different, mini ITX motherboard or such. Also, had they used Oculink, not only would the system be more upgradable, but they probably could have sold that motherboard standalone and it been a great option. I mean, the 12th gen Intel i5 isn't great now, it's been a few years, but you still have up to 64 gigs of DDR5, you have onboard 10 gig using that M.2 connection, you have two 2.5 gig ports, 4 lanes of PCIe Gen 4, 2 lanes of PCIe Gen 3, and 2 Oculink connections, which one would be limited to just 2 lanes, but still, that could be a really sick motherboard for people to use in a home server build that's not a ZimaCube. But once again, since they use that ADP connection, it kind of limits some of the usefulness, which is definitely a pretty big bummer, especially when you're spending $1,100 on this. Now, frankly, I was never interested in this $1,100 model. I was really only ever interested in the standard ZimaCube, which I believe you can get now for $650. It seems like they definitely cut that down to not sort of overstretch the limitations of the N100's 9 PCIe lanes, but it seems like the final product they landed on might be a little bit more solid than the prototype I looked at. So I may be interested in checking that out. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments if you want me to check out the base ZimaCube model or not. As far as the ZimaCube Pro goes, it does seem like they figured out the noise issues for the most part. Power consumption isn't amazing, and really the lack of a standardized connection for the motherboard and the backplane is definitely a bummer, especially considering it's $1,200. That being said, if you're not planning on using ZimaOS and you want to just install Unraid or TrueNAS or Proxmox or something like that, it does seem like it gets the job done. So it's really going to come down to you as to whether or not you think those features are worth spending $1,200, or if you want to go a different route, like building something in a Johnsbow case, or building something like one of my TrueNAS systems that I built in this video here, which if you want to check out, maybe go watch that now. That's about it for this one though, so as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay curious, and I really can't wait to see you in the next one.